Greetings, friends and fellow freelancers. Welcome back to another episode of Tabletop Mercenary. This week, I wanted to talk about a topic that I first became aware of pretty early in my career as a writer. And if you haven't been in the trenches as a ghostwriter, as a blogger, etc., for various business companies, you may not have come across this term before. However, it can be very useful if you're planning on making TTRPG content, and if you're looking at this not just as a quick gig to do every now and again or something you want to pick up on the weekends, but a way that you want to make money and be relevant as a creator for years to come. And that word is essentially evergreen content. The explanation I first had very early in my career when I was trying to figure out what companies meant by this, because it was a buzzword that they would use a lot, is imagine you're writing a blog. Now, let's say you wanted to write funny movie reviews, just let people know what's coming out in theaters right now. Even if these blogs are very popular for films that are currently in theaters, as soon as that film goes out of theaters, whether it's going to be on streaming or people would be, God forbid, renting it from an actual physical store, this is a long time ago where I read this, your review might be less relevant. The faster something that you're covering is going to fall out of the mainstream, the less often people are going to look for it. So even if it's very popular in the moment right now, that doesn't mean it's going to be popular a year from now, 5 years from now, 10 years from now. And if you were to say, flip that script, if you wanted to write, say, a how-to article on a life hack for your kitchen, it's how to clean your kitchen using lemons, something like that. This is content that is not necessarily going to explode big right now. It might, but it's not necessarily going to. But it's going to continue to be relevant no matter when you're reading this. It'll be relevant today. It would have been relevant in quarantine. It might be relevant 10 years from now when someone's looking for an interesting way to keep their house smelling nice and keep the stains off their counters. In this sense, that is far more evergreen and far more long-lasting than the earlier funny movie review I mentioned. Neither of these are bad content, but they are geared to be very different things, and one has a longer shelf life than the other. You might argue one of them has a half-life, where the other has a shelf life. And this is something that you should keep in mind when you're designing gaming content. For folks who didn't watch the previous episodes I put together, I made a point that no matter what system you're designing for, no matter what trends you're currently seeing in the market, the only thing that remains the same is everything changes. And if you don't try to predict those changes, if you don't try to prepare for them as a creator when you're making things, those changes are going to leave you behind. As a good example, when I first started getting into the field of professional TTRPG design, Pathfinder was the go-to game. D&D 4th edition had been roundly rejected by the gaming public, or at least a large part of it, and 5th edition had not yet really hit its stride. I believe I first started putting work out around the time that the playtest was kind of becoming what would eventually be 5th edition. And even after 5e first came out, Pathfinder still had a really loyal, really large fan base. And so a lot of the products I put together, a lot of the articles that I wrote, particularly my Pathfinder character conversion guides, remained very popular. They were being shared around, they were hitting a lot of keywords, people were very interested in these. But as time went on, and Pathfinder became Pathfinder 1st edition as the 2nd edition came out, as Dungeons & Dragons 5th edition rose to its massive market dominance, a lot of the projects I was working on became less relevant to people. As a good example of, while my Pathfinder conversion guides still get views, it's nowhere near what they were drawing at the height of their creative popularity. That doesn't mean they're worthless. It doesn't mean I'm going to take them down and get rid of them, but they're not something I can depend on for regular income, and they're not really something I'm adding more to now that the public has moved on and we're looking for other stuff. The same thing for a lot of the gaming products I've created. I worked on a lot of feat lists for Pathfinder's 1st edition early on in my career, and while those occasionally move one here and there, it's probably just either people who didn't pick them up in the first place and are still going through Pathfinder Classic, or it's people who are picking it up out of curiosity. Maybe they want to try this older edition they never really got a chance to pick up. But the things that I do sell most consistently, and which have some sort of life beyond their initial release, especially once different games become popular, once different trends come into place, are things that are genre neutral or game system neutral. For folks who haven't been through my archive, one of my top sellers is 100 NPCs you might meet at the tavern. I believe it was the first piece of mine to hit gold status, and now it's the first one to hit, I believe it's not adamantine. On DriveThruRPG, it's one of the second highest tiers. And it keeps selling copies because it can be used with any fantasy game. It doesn't matter if you're playing Pathfinder, if you're playing basically any version of Dungeons and Dragons. It doesn't matter if you're doing Powered by the Apocalypse. It doesn't matter if you're playing Savage Worlds. As long as you're running a high fantasy game where you can run into gnomes and halflings and elves and half-elves and orcs when you go down to the tavern, you can use this NPC supplement. And most of my long-term sellers are similar lists. I have a baker's dozen of noble families. It's not geared toward any particular fantasy system. And because of that, you can use it in basically any fantasy system. And it's not just that genre. I've had equal success with science fiction. Lots of my early science fiction supplements, whether it's 100 sci-fi cocktails, whether it's 100 NPCs to meet at a spaceport, things like this tend to get picked up, whether or not someone's running Starfinder or Traveler or Star Wars, whatever it is. People need GM prep and they need flavor guides. They need stuff to do the work for them so that they're not spending all of their creativity figuring out, well, what's the name of the ship in Docking Bay 3, or what's the name of this random halfling who's tending bar tonight. And I'm not saying that everyone should only make genre-neutral content. It's the only way that you can make a living doing this. But I am saying that if you're looking at being a game designer as a long-term investment for your career, ask what's going to happen if X, Y, or Z game falls out of popularity. Or if it's not popular now, what happens if it gets popular? As I said in my last video, you can't go around chasing design trends. In the same way, you can't necessarily predict what's going to happen. But just because you don't know exactly what the future is going to look like, that doesn't mean that you shouldn't try to make something that's viable in multiple markets. Whether your current supplement of gritty NPCs to find in the inner city is meant for World of Darkness, can it still be used for Call of Cthulhu? Could it still be used for a generic horror game? Can people still use it in D20 Modern, whatever system they're running? The more people who can use your product and the more situations that it is viable for, the more likely you are to make sales to a variety of different people. Because while you can be a big fish in a small pond if you're designing for a particular game system that gets popular or which has a loyal fan base, if that game stops being popular, if people move on to something else, or if the content you made is not compatible with another edition or another system, then it really loses value. And as with everything else, it's important to have a bit of a mixed plate. You don't want to rely all on one thing, because that's probably the surest way to shoot yourself in the foot. So think about that when you sit down at your design table and you're plotting out what projects you're going to work on, what supplements you're going to release, and what you want your back catalog to look like. Because while I will be the first to say you can make a lot of sales if you design a product that everybody wants to get their hands on, whether you design a new system for dealing with morale, whether you deal with a way to overcome the feat tax for a particular game, whether you just make cool adventures that people love to go on because it means the game master doesn't have to do as much work and everybody still gets to have as much fun. But remember that you don't want to put all your eggs in one basket, because if this mechanical system stops being popular or never gets popular in the first place, if you're designing for a smaller system or your own system, which happens more than occasionally, you need to ask what you're going to fall back on for this. And I don't want to be the sort of person who says that you shouldn't quit your day job, but you should diversify your content so that no matter what the market ends up doing, you're going to be viable next quarter, next year, 5 years from now. And a lot of that is going to depend on what kind of products did you put out, and can they be used in multiple systems, multiple settings, multiple genres. Because tabletop RPGs are not as big a niche of the publishing industry as we tend to think. More importantly, as has been pointed out lots of times, if you have 5 people at a table, usually only one of them is making a purchase because the game masters are the ones who use a majority of our content. So while you'll occasionally get lucky and everybody at the table will buy a base rulebook, or everyone at the table will get this supplement for building their characters, most of the time you're going to have 1 out of every 5 gamers actually buy the product you made for a particular game. So keep that in mind, that your market is always smaller than you think. And while it's going to continue growing as long as people keep getting into gaming, you can't always depend on the next generation to pick up whatever it is you made. So you want the biggest possible pool you can get, and you don't want to unnecessarily narrow your audience unless you are confident that you're going to be a big fish in that much smaller pond. But that's it for this week's edition of Tabletop Mercenary. Make sure you like, share, subscribe, all that. And as usual, if you have a question I didn't answer this week, or if you have a topic regarding TTRPG, writing, publishing, etc., that I haven't yet covered on the show, please leave it in the comments down below. I want to make sure I get to all of your questions and give you the answers that you need. So, until next time, it's your Tabletop Mercenary, signing off. First and foremost, thank you for staying to the end of this episode of Tabletop Mercenary. If there's a question you have about being an RPG creator, please don't hesitate to put it in the comments below so I can address it in a future episode. If you want to help me keep the lights on and keep this show going, then please consider subscribing to the channel, liking the video, and giving it a share on your own social media pages to help boost the signal. Lastly, if you really enjoyed this episode, please consider leaving a tip by buying me a Ko-fi or becoming a Patreon patron at the links in the video description below. You'll find me on both sites under the name The Literary Mercenary.